So today we're going to talk about experimental error and blunder. We've mentioned these for the last couple labs, and now it's time to sort of make it official and get this stuff in your notebook. So here we go. A blunder. So if you watch this little video clip, yeah, that's kind of a blunder. So a blunder is something that you could go back and fix, right? You could start over. Could make sure you're holding on to the ballerina a little differently. Anyway, the problem could or should have been fixed, eliminated, or avoided in the lab. You could go back and rerun the experiment and not do this thing. That's the thing, is the blunder. A blunder is also known as human error, but don't use that phrase because it has error in it and you'll get it confused with experimental error. Okay, so there's human error, which we call a blunder, and experimental error. So blunders are things that you could fix. Experimental errors. They are estimations or assumptions. You will find them in almost every lab you do, and it's kind of easy to recognize them, but it's a little bit more difficult to come up with them in the first place. So this is what we'll be practicing. Experimental errors are unavoidable based on the time, space, and materials that you are given to do the lab. If you have to use a ruler as opposed to a caliper, then that's going to result in some differences in precision, and that's an experimental error. So they're unavoidable given the parameters of the experiment you're running. They could be made during the procedure, the measurements, the calculation, the graphing, the setup of the equipment that you're using. So any of these estimations or assumptions can take place at any time during the experiment, whether it's the pre-lab, the lab itself, or the things you're doing after the lab. And I've mentioned this a bunch, but experimental errors result in variation in the data. Now that variation could be within a data set, such as the 5 blood spatter that you measured the other day in the lab, or between data sets. For example, you all dropped blood from height of 25 centimeters. If everything were right in the world, everybody should have gotten the exact same diameter for each blood spatter for every test. Well, that didn't happen, so there has to be some sort of experimental error that accounts for that, that explains why that didn't happen. So here are some examples. You decide whether they are blunders or experimental errors. 1 bottle of luminol was left over from the previous class, but the other bottle contained freshly made luminol. So one group is using the fresh luminol, another group is using the leftover from the previous class. And they get differences in data. What caused that? Is that a blunder or an experimental error? Blunder. And I would say blunder because there's no reason that both groups couldn't have used the same luminol, whether they could split what was left over or they could have both used freshly made. Okay, let's go to the blood typing lab. The results indicated that one group mixed up the anti-A and anti-B antibodies. A blunder again, because somebody mixed up the two things. They dropped the anti-B antibodies in the anti-A depression in the tray that we were using. Now let's look at calipers. 3 people measured the diameter of the blood spatter with a caliper. They got readings of 1.730 centimeters, 1.735 centimeters, and 1.725 centimeters. Who's wrong? Nobody's wrong. They each read the caliper to the correct precision, which means out to 3 decimal places. There was some variation in where the individuals saw the vernier scale line up with the centimeter scale above. So this, in fact, is an experimental error. There's variation in data, but it was caused by error, experimental error, sort of built into reading instruments. That's what caused that variation in data. Okay, so that's that. That's about all there is to it, although it's a little bit more difficult than this is implying. So there's a worksheet for you to try and identify which ones are blunders and errors, and that's in the classroom. Thanks for listening.